Hi, my name is Alan McGraw, and this is my Module 5 journal regarding veterans of the Vietnam War. So the first question for the journal entry is, what are the main themes of this module's material? So the main themes I picked up on in this module's material was firstly the mixed reception that veterans received upon returning home from Vietnam. In all prior wars, soldiers had come home to celebrations, parades, many types of shows of support and congratulations and all those things. And that is not at all what Vietnam veterans experienced. They were viewed very negatively by large portions of the American public, and so they came home, many of them feeling unwelcome and unwanted, which is truly a shame, but that was one of the realities that veterans dealt with, veterans of Vietnam. Another one of the main themes was the establishment of all the anti-war groups that were established during the war. One that really had a considerable amount of sway was the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. John Kerry actually was one of the leaders of that group, and it was guys who had actually been over in Vietnam and had served in Vietnam, and once they got back were protesting the war, claiming the war was immoral and all sorts of different accusations about atrocities being committed, and that they were practically ordered to or ordered by proxy to commit these atrocities and things like that. So that was very unique to this time period. I have not heard of such for any other war, that you would have a group of veterans come back from that war and actively protest against it. Another main theme I picked up on in this module was the extreme level of distrust of the government and military leaders that developed during this time period. In prior wars, there had been Americans have always had some level of distrust of the government. It's kind of in our nature, but in prior wars, especially in World War I, World War II, the people tended to believe in the general goodness of the government, and that government leaders actually did have the best interests of America at heart. But that really begins to change during this period, and there was a real culture war going on in the United States, partially due to the Vietnam War, and some things were covered up, things like the My Lai atrocity that happened there, and the cover-up that then followed it, that and along with things like Watergate, just really caused the erosion of the trust that the American people had for the government, and really just it caused the country to be very divided, and unfortunately the veterans were kind of lumped in along with the government and others for people not to be trusted. Like I said, stories of those massacres, many civilians erroneously, thought that all soldiers over there must be committing atrocities like these, and so veterans themselves were looked down upon even if they had done nothing wrong. So the next portion of the journal is the question that says, what are the most significant continuities and changes you've seen? I'm going to go ahead and answer question 3, which I feel like ties into this one, which is, how did the major points of evolution come about? So firstly, the continuities I saw in this module are that the soldiers fought bravely and did their duty. There were some exceptions to that. Drug use was higher in this war and things of that nature, but on the whole, the American soldiers fought bravely, did their duty, followed orders in a war that really was hard to understand why we were there and things of that nature, yet they still did their job and did it honorably and admirably. Another continuity with prior prior modules is the soldiers were largely made up of draftees again. That's something that these days is, we haven't had a draft since Vietnam, so this was kind of the last of that era where most of the combat troops were made up of draftees, people who did not necessarily want to be there and had been yanked from their lives to go be a part of it, which also leads to more issues. Another continuity is the continuing evolution of the understanding of the psychological effects of combat on veterans. PTSD, the terminology of post-traumatic stress disorder, actually stems from this Vietnam period. At first they were calling it post-Vietnam syndrome, and then later it morphed into this official psychological diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So that is something that had been evolving ever since really the Civil War, and really came to fruition here in Vietnam, the following Vietnam. And also there's the continued push for improved benefits, especially amongst veterans who were struggling with things like PTSD. So getting clinics to help those guys, and these storefront clinics that they would have where guys could come and talk and kind of share their experiences and try and help themselves there. So the changes, major changes I saw in this period were that the soldiers felt very little support from the home front. The media reporting things like massacres and atrocities really eroded the support for the war and also the soldiers on the home front. And so that was something unique in American history, really, for the military to be fighting a war that so many of the people at home did not want us to be in. Another of the big changes was that far more men didn't serve than did, which alienated veterans more. So when I say far more men didn't serve than did, I'm talking of the total population of men who were capable of serving military age men. So and really this is only true. The only time that more men did serve than didn't were in times like the Civil War, World War I and World War II, really. So it was kind of just a brief history there, a brief part of American history where that was the norm, and this was where that changed back. And like today in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there far more men of military age, including myself. I did not serve, even though I had friends that did. It was a large minority that did serve these days, whereas that hadn't been the case in World War I and II. In fact, in Robert Schulzinger's book, A Time for Peace, The Legacy of the Vietnam War, he gives the stats that there were 26 million military-age men in the Vietnam War. Of those, only about 8 million ended up serving in the military in some form or fashion. And of those, only about 2.2 million actually ended up being sent to Vietnam. So 2.2 million out of a total of 26 million possible really is a relatively small number. So there were plenty of people back home who were of military age but didn't participate in the war, and so therefore could not understand what veterans had been through. That I know, me personally, I didn't see this in any readings, but my belief is that part of why World War II veterans seemed to readjust to life so well in comparison to Vietnam veterans is that it was a common experience. It wasn't something, I mean, your neighbor down the street, if he was close to your age, he probably experienced something very similar to you. Most guys had been shipped overseas and experienced the same hardships, whereas that was not the case anymore come Vietnam. The reason for these changes uh, were the soldiers feeling little support from the home front. That's obvious. It was just because the people's trust in the government and the military to go along with it had just eroded to a point where they were not supported anymore, not like they had been. And then also the reason that so many fewer men were involved in this war is due to the scale of the war. It wasn't a world war, so it wasn't necessary to get too many men involved. In fact, the government was constantly throughout the Vietnam War trying to win the war with as few troops as they possibly could, and so they would just slowly keep ramping it up instead of going all in right up front. So on to the fourth question for this journal entry, which is, what was the most surprising thing you learned in this module? So the most surprising thing I learned was something that is talked about in Schultzinger's book, about how many veterans made up stories about atrocities they had committed. I just found that to be very surprising. I've heard about, and it's still a common thing, that men will pretend to be veterans and pretend to have gone through these combat experiences either to make themselves look good. Some of them actually are veterans and they just embellish their experiences, and that's very common. But normally it's in a good way, like they'll try and make themselves look good in it. Whereas he describes in his book that there were quite a few guys that were being caught making up atrocities and saying they had participated in them, but that could not be corroborated at all, which is kind of just a strange phenomenon, and kind of hard to understand for me why you would ever want to do that. But I think it was kind of, that was the norm at the time, is the thinking that all men committed atrocities, so it was probably just to fit in with the crowd that they did so. On to the fifth question, which is the creating the thesis argument. So my thesis for this module would be, the Vietnam War is unique in American history for the way in which American veterans were treated. The fact that relatively few men of military age ended up being sent to Vietnam, combined with the prevalence of anti-war sentiment, caused many returning vets to feel unwanted and unappreciated upon their return. This rift between veterans and the civilian population took several decades to heal, and that era is still a blight on the nation's character due to the poor treatment of those Vietnam veterans. So question 6 says, discuss how this module's material connects with the material of the previous modules. So the connections I saw were, again, the better understanding of PTSD. They're really trying to get to the root causes of why these guys were having so many psychological issues, and many of them were late onset. They started to notice that really the worst cases tended to onset far after they had returned home. Anywhere from 9 months to 36 months after they got home, that they would start experiencing these symptoms. So they really started to come to grips with that disease, and really made a bunch of the steps to in terms of being able to diagnose it, and things that we still use today for our veterans. And another way it connects was just the constant push for better benefits for veterans. After the GI Bill, that covered pretty much everything they could want financially, but there were still ways to help veterans. And with the unique problems faced by Vietnam veterans, with so many having PTSD issues and things of that nature, some of those benefits were just pushing to keep open the storefront clinics that guys would go in and be able to get help and just talk with fellow veterans about what they had experienced in Vietnam, and try and heal that way just by sharing their experiences. So they had to fight to keep things like that open. Reagan tried to close them down at one point, and they were able to fight to keep them open. So the last question is that applies to me anyway is question 8, because I'm focusing on the historiography. So it says discuss and prove a major assertion of the narrative discussed in this module using one of the sources. So one of the narratives of the module was the continuing evolution of the understanding of PTSD, which I've mentioned several times. So both Robert Schultzinger's book, A Time for Peace, and Patrick Hagopian, I think I'm pronouncing that right, his book, The Vietnam War in American Memory, Veterans, Memorials, and the Politics of Healing. Both of them go into pretty extensive detail about the continuing understanding of PTSD, and both of them mention heavily the RAP groups, as they were called, which were kind of the earliest therapy groups that were made up of veterans, and the psychologists who were involved would, rather than talk to them as a psychologist client, which had typically been the case before, they would go in and just kind of be a facilitator in the group and just an equal partner in the group, really just someone taking part in it along with all the veterans. And it really helped veterans to open up, discuss their experiences, and really also helped these psychologists begin to understand PTSD, because they were being able to sit there and just watch these guys and see the symptoms and hear about the symptoms and what they were dealing with, which really gave them a better feel for what they were dealing with, what this disease really was. So, like I said, both Schultzinger and Hagopian go into this very extensively. It seemed to me that Schultzinger had a little more level-headed approach of understanding that these were, places that these psychologists were surely trying to benefit themselves somewhat, but really were in an effort to help these veterans and to help them get better and to help understand the issues they were facing more. Whereas, as I was reading Hagopian's book, his book definitely seems to be very much anti-war in his slant towards it, and very cynical in that he repeatedly talks about how it was really a push to try and politicize the war, and that they were trying to get more and more guys to admit to committing atrocities. That way the government would be more likely to shut down our involvement in the war earlier, and things of that nature, and that it was kind of secondary to them to try and help the veterans. And I personally have a hard time believing that. It seemed to me he was had the activist slant going on with his writing. But anyway, I think that both of these books, though, do a very good job of describing how this the revelation of making this diagnosis of PTSD and how it came about, the understanding of the symptoms of it, and what all fell under it. And anyway, that is all for this journal. Thank you for watching, and I will see you later. Thank you.